This amazing game from Bobby Fischer was played at the Interzonal in 1967 at Susa. His opponent is the great Leonid Stein. And a footnote on this game, it was actually expunged from the records because Fischer withdrew from this event. But fortunately, it did get out, and it is an amazing game, very complicated. Let us jump right in. Fischer has white, Stein has black. Fischer begins with e4, e5, and we quickly have his favorite Ruy Lopez or Spanish opening on the board. And it is the main line of the Ruy Lopez, b5, bishop b3, d6. c3, of course, the idea is to maybe play d4, give the bishop a place to tuck away at c2, castles, and h3 to stop the bishop at c8 from pinning the knight and make it harder for white to play d4. And here, Leonid Stein plays bishop to b7, or the Zaitsev system, a pretty aggressive system, and the bishop is aiming at this e4 pawn directly. So d4 is played from Fischer, and we know with black and the Ruy Lopez, this knight at c6 is often a difficult piece to find a home, so it begins a very long journey at this point to find a better square. Knight to a5, obviously Fischer does not want to exchange off that bishop, it's a strong piece, so he tucks it away. Knight to c4, b3, knight to b6 is played, knight b to d2, and then knight b to d7. So a long journey to land on a square it could have landed on in one move, but obviously it's not that simple. White was doing things too. So we can see, though, black's structure is similar to a Breyer system of the Spanish. b4 from white, gaining some space on the queen side. Black takes on d4, pawn takes, and now this central structure, this small central structure, will be black's main target in the position, trying to weaken it, either capture a pawn or get the structure to advance. And he plays an immediate a5. And the reason is he wants to play c5. So he wants to distract this b pawn away so he can attack the center with c5 and just take the pawn back later. Fischer takes on a5, and Stein does not immediately recapture that pawn, but he plays c5. Again, his idea is to compromise white's center in some way. Here Fischer plays an aggressive and strong move. He plays the move e5. He gains space in the center and opens up this nice diagonal for this bishop aiming right at black's king. So that pawn at e5 combined with the power down this diagonal is going to be strong for white. Now, it does clear the way for black's bishop too, but white's bishop at the moment is probably a little more dangerous, aiming at h7. Black takes on e5, Fischer takes with the pawn, knight to d5, and knight to e4, and we can see all of these potential thematic ideas for white. This is a very strong attacking position. A knight can go to g5 and also add pressure to the h7 pawn. Here, black plays knight to b4 to irritate this bishop at c2, and Fischer plays the most natural move, just bishop b1, keeping it on the diagonal. As it turns out, a very strong move would have been knight e to g5, and after black takes the bishop, white can take with the queen, and now he's threatening mate on h7, and after g6 to block that mate, e6 helps sort of tear that structure down. If f6, then just rook to d1, taking advantage of that pin, and if pawn takes knight, rook takes d7 wins a piece because it hits the queen and these two bishops, and black cannot defend both of the bishops. And obviously, if pawn takes pawn, then knight takes e6, forks the rook and the queen. After bishop to b1, rook takes that pawn at a5. Queen to e2 helps give some strength to the knight at e4. Knight to b6, Stein is going all in on the queen side, aiming at this very strong c4 square for his knight. Here Fischer plays knight f to g5, and this is a very nasty threat attached to it. If it were white's move here, he could play the move knight to f6 check, which is just decisive. If pawn takes knight, then queen to h5, and there's just no way to stop mate, because the knight and bishop both control h7, so if he takes the knight, queen h7 is still mate. So this would end the game. So Stein, knowing that, takes the knight off at e4, but he gives up that really nice bishop in order to do it, and Fischer's able to keep his powerful bishop on b1. So that's a very good exchange for Fischer. Queen takes e4. Obviously, at the moment, Fischer is threatening mate on h7, so g6 to block that line of attack. But now queen to h4, again threatening mate on h7 with the knight aiming at that pawn. And black doesn't want to weaken the pawn structure in front of his king, but he really has no choice, because if he plays bishop takes knight, after bishop takes bishop, the threat of Fischer getting in on these dark squares and delivering mate on g7 is just too strong. If black, say, plays queen to d4, offering the exchange of queens as well as threatening the rook at a1, then just queen to h6. He doesn't even have to worry about the rook. If queen takes rook, bishop f6, and mate on g7 would be unstoppable. So knight to d7 would be necessary to control this square, but then he could play this powerful idea, bishop to f5, threatening to take the knight, then play the bishop into f6, and then mate. And if pawn takes bishop, now bishop to f6, with the threat of mate on g7 is decisive after knight takes, pawn takes. And notice, because the g-pawn is not here anymore, the queen defends this pawn. So because of that, black would have to give up his queen to stop mate on g7. So because of that, black has to weaken the structure in front of his king. So he plays h5. Here, queen to g3 from Fischer. Black keeps going in on the queen side with knight to c4. He's threatening, by the way, knight takes f7. This is a very powerful threat from white. To move like this, pinning that rook, black would just be in huge trouble. So knight to c4 is played, and Fischer does not play that move. It would have been a good move here, but he plays the move knight to f3, and he criticized himself after this move. He said this was a mistake, and he preferred, instead of knight takes f7, the move e6, which is also obviously very strong, just undermining further this pawn cover around black's king. But he played knight to f3 instead. Again, he was very critical of himself for that move. King to g7 for black, queen to f4, threatening to work that queen in to h6. The rook goes to h8 to keep the queen out. Now e6 is played. Obviously, the queen takes f7. Mate is threatened, so black has to do something about that. He plays f5 instead of f6. Now, the idea is that that limits the scope of this bishop on b1. But Fischer noticed something, that it really doesn't limit the scope of that bishop at all. And he goes ahead and just takes the pawn at f5, sacrificing the bishop, which really cannot be taken. If Stein had taken the bishop, then queen to g3 check is bad news. Let's say king to h7, then bishop to g5, and black really has no good choices. If bishop takes, knight takes check, there's nothing black can do. He's going to lose. Anywhere the king goes, knight to f7 check, either via a fork or a discovery, is going to win the queen. So he can't do that. If rook to g8, pinning the bishop, then after rook a to d1, hitting the queen, say knight to d6 to block, then bishop takes e7 wins. There's nothing he can do. If rook takes bishop, then bishop takes queen, and he's hitting this undefended rook at a5, as well as this rook hanging on g3. And if queen e7, then queen takes d6. He's still got this beautiful pawn at e6. This is totally winning for Fischer. So the bishop cannot be taken. Queen to f8 is played instead, with the idea that when the bishop moves, queens can be traded. And here, again, Fischer pointed this move out. He missed this idea of knight to h4, a very hard move to find over the board. And the reason this move works is because after bishop takes knight, which seems like a very strong move for black, queen takes h4, queen takes f5. Looks like black might be winning, but he isn't. White has too much pressure after queen to e7 check, king to g8, queen to d8, king to g7, queen to c7, king g8, then e7. And the threat of queening creates a completely winning position for white. So Fischer pointed out this knight h4 move. But in the game, he plays the move bishop to e4, offering the exchange of queens and saying, I'm up a pawn, I have the two bishops in an open position, so I feel I can win this game. So queen takes bishop, bishop takes queen, rook to e8 to place the rook opposite this dangerous pawn, rook a to d1 with the possibility of coming to d7 and pinning that bishop, rook to a6 threatens to take on e6, but also threatens to block on this d6 square and exchange some pieces. The rook to d7 is played. Rook takes pawn, but then knight to g5, and this rook has no real place to go. He plays rook to f6, but now just bishop to f3, with the two rooks hitting the pinned bishop. Black goes ahead and takes on f4, but white has an even stronger idea than taking the bishop at e7, and that's this move, knight to e6 check, forking the king and the rook. And after king f6, knight takes. In this position, Fischer is up in exchange. But it's still not over yet. I mean, this pawn is hanging. These two pawns are quite strong. This is not some sort of easy position to win for white. The knight goes to e5, hitting the rook as well as threatening to wreck the pawn structure at f3. Rook to b7, attacks that b5 pawn. Bishop to d6. Now, there's a pretty nasty threat here. The threat is knight takes bishop check, followed by rook takes rook. So Fischer plays king to f1 to step out of that threat. Now knight takes bishop is not check. He would just be able to take the rook at e8. Knight to c2 hits the rook at e1. Here Fischer plays the very strong rook to e4. It's in the middle of the board, but it's really anchored there. It's very strong, and it's very hard for black to do anything about that. Knight to d4, threatening to take twice on f3 and win a pawn. Rook to b6, pins the bishop at d6. Rook to d8 defends, but now knight to d5 check. King to f5, knight to e3 check, just repositioning that knight to a stronger square. King to e6, adding a second defender to the bishop at d6. But now bishop to e2, threatening to pick up a pawn at b5. King to d7 from black, and Fischer does go ahead and take on b5. And after knight b5, rook takes b5. Here Fischer is up an exchange and a pawn. King to c6 from Stein. a4 defends the rook. Bishop to c7. The rook would like to land on the 7th rank, so Fischer plays king to e2 to keep that rook out of d2. g5 advancing on the king side. Black would love to trade off as many pawns as possible. That really takes away white's winning chances. So g3 from Fischer. So whichever pawn advances, he can sort of lock it up and keep that extra material. Rook to a8 goes after Fischer's pawn at a4. Rook to b2. Fischer's rook can shift to a2 or d2, controlling that important d file. Here, a little tactic from black. He plays rook to f8. The threat here is to play rook takes f2 check. And after king takes rook, knight to d3 check, forking the king and the rook. And after king e2, after king e2, knight takes b2. This is actually still winning for white, but it's a much harder game, much harder winning process for white after that. So to avoid all of that, Fischer plays f4, gaining space, hitting that knight, knocking it from its nice central square. Pawn takes, knight to f7, aiming for that d6 square. Rook to e6 check, knight to d6, and now f5. The pawn advances. It cannot be captured because the knight is pinned by the rook, and it's defended by the knight at e3. So rook goes back to a8, attacking the pawn, but instead of defending that pawn, Fischer plays rook to d2, followed by rook takes a4, and then f6. And in this position, Leonid Stein resigned because of the power of this f6 pawn, combined with Fischer's material advantage. So just to show how powerful that f6 pawn is, let's say king to d7 to try to stop it. He can just play rook to e7 to kick the king back, then f7. And there's really nothing black can do except give up material to stop that pawn. If he plays rook to a8, the obvious move, it looks like he's stopping the pawn, but then Fischer could play this powerful idea, rook to e8. And if the knight takes the rook, then he just pushes straight ahead. He doesn't take the knight, pushes straight ahead and promotes to a queen. If the rook captures instead, then he has this intermediate move, rook takes d6 check, removing the knight, which defends the rook, and after king takes rook, he could take the rook and promote to a queen. An amazingly complicated game. I don't think I really got to the real center of it as best as I tried. an imperfect game, but it's the kind of game no one ever plays perfectly. Leonid Stein, a very strong player, and a great performance from Bobby Fischer. Hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog.